Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. This podcast of the People's Pharmacy is brought to you by Squatty Potty Toilet Stools. They create healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. Learn more about toilet posture and health at squattypotty.com. That's SQUATTYPOTTY.com.
When you shop for food, do you ever wonder where and how it was grown? Does it matter how farmers manage their land? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Does exposure to a wide variety of microbes at an early age reduce our chances of having allergy and asthma problems later in life? We explore the metaphorical and literal connections between bacterial communities in the soil and those in our own bodies.
Dr. Daphne Miller is a family physician who's examined the connection between innovative family farming and our own health and healing. What can rejuvenating depleted soil teach us about rejuvenating ourselves?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, we talk with Dr. Miller about pharmacology, spelled with an F.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, roseroot, also known as rhodiola, has shown promise in a small study of depressed individuals. They were randomly assigned to take either the herb, the antidepressant sertraline, or a placebo pill. After 3 months, those taking sertraline were slightly more likely than those on rhodiola to have improvement in their symptoms, but there was no significant difference between the two groups. People in both groups had done better than those on placebo. Twice as many of the people on the medication had side effects, especially nausea and sexual dysfunction. The authors suggest that rhodiola might be helpful in treating people who don't do well on standard antidepressants.
Blueberries are rich in antioxidants and polyphenols, and they've been reported to lower blood pressure and boost brain power. Older people in a randomized trial of blueberry juice had an improvement in tests of cognitive function after 3 months. Now, researchers studying rats report that blueberries may be able to offer protection against the neural effects of PTSD. In post-traumatic stress disorder, levels of the neurotransmitter norepinephrine soar. In the study, rats were put under stress by exposing them to cats. Their diets were either enriched with blueberries or standard lab chow. A third group of rats had neither stress nor blueberries. The blueberry diet protected the rats under stress from the effects of norepinephrine. It's quite a jump from rats to humans, and as yet there's no research demonstrating that eating blueberries can help human beings suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. On the other hand, blueberries have no known side effects and might help some people deal with the challenges of PTSD.
Rose hips form on rose bushes after pollination. They're high in vitamin C and other nutrients, including beta-carotene, lutein, zeaxanthin, and lycopene. Traditionally, the rose hips have been made into herbal teas, jams, and jellies. Now, rosehip extract has been used in tissue culture studies of breast cancer cells. These triple-negative cells are especially aggressive and tend to attack young African American and Latino women. The cells exposed to the highest concentration of rosehip extract were 50% less able to reproduce. In addition, they were significantly less able to migrate. This basic research needs to be followed up with animal and clinical studies to see if the rosehip promise will hold up. But the scientists hope it may offer an inexpensive way to prevent or treat a dangerous disease.
People who consume 3 or more alcoholic beverages a day increase their risk for liver cancer, but coffee may counteract that danger. Scientists at the World Cancer Research Fund analyzed data from 34 studies involving over 8 million subjects. Nearly 25,000 had developed liver cancer. The investigators discovered that 1 cup of coffee a day could reduce the risk of liver cancer by 14%. Of course, this is not a license to abuse alcohol, but the discovery that coffee has anti-cancer activity comes as good news, and it's not the first time. Coffee consumption has previously been associated with a lower likelihood of developing mouth, bowel, and uterine cancer.
A few years ago, children began developing mysterious symptoms after severe upper respiratory infections. Some of these kids went on to experience sudden paralysis. The overall picture looked like polio, but tests were negative for this virus. Now investigators have tracked the cases of paralysis to a mutated enterovirus called D68. It's a viral strain that behaves a lot like polio. In its usual form, it causes symptoms typical of the common cold. But the mutated version, labeled B1, seems far more dangerous. It's too early to say whether this enterovirus is the cause of sudden onset paralysis in children, but that's what scientists at the University of California, San Francisco suspect. Scientists don't know whether this enterovirus will return and cause more infections this year, but they remain vigilant. No one can say what the prognosis is for the paralyzed youngsters. Most have recovered some function, but none has recovered completely.
Researchers have turned to rats to find out whether applying ice after a muscle injury speeds healing. Although icing reduces inflammation and swelling, the research suggests that it actually slows blood vessel formation and recovery. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon. I'm a medical anthropologist.
And I'm Joe Graydon. I'm a pharmacologist. Pharmacology is the study of how drugs work, what they do for us and to us. It's spelled Pharmacology, pharmacology. Today, though, we're going to spell pharmacology with an F. Pharmacology, also pronounced pharmacology.
To find out more, we turn to Dr. Daphne Miller, a family physician and founder of Whole Family MD, the first integrative primary care practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Her book is Farmacology: What Innovative Family Farming Can Teach Us About Health and Healing. That's pharmacology spelled with an F.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Miller.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Dr. Miller, you're considered a pioneer in eco-medicine, and that certainly is what your new book is all about. What got you interested in the connection between our health and traditional family farms?
Well, I had been interested in nutrition for a long time, Terry, and have written a book previously on the connections between our health and traditional diets. And I've spent a lot of time advocating for real food diets and trying to connect my patients with ways of eating that could keep them healthy. But at a certain point, I realized that I was really being very short-sighted in the way that I was doing my work, and that I was very focused on this concept of food as medicine. And that, in fact, where the real medicine lies is the places where that food is grown, our farms and our water systems and everything that produces the food that we eat. And so I started to pay a lot more attention to agricultural systems and the way that food is grown. And I realized that, in fact, they are a healing system, much the same way that medicine is a healing system. And that the guardians of that system, the people who are caring for those farmers, are, in fact, healers, and in many ways more powerful healers than maybe we even are as physicians. So I decided to leave my 8x10 medical office and head out to farms to learn from the healers of the earth.
Well, it's so interesting because I grew up on a dairy farm, and my Uncle Leo, who, had a small family farm, basically 40, 50 cattle, he tended his soil with such loving care. He rotated his crops. He would let a crop go fallow for a year or two. He planted the clover. He tested the soil. It was like the soil was the lifeblood of the farm, and he cared about it so passionately. You refer to the soil and the farm as a system. And I wonder why we don't do the same thing when it comes to our health in our own bodies. We had the amazing opportunity to interview Dr. David Servan-Schreiber, and he talked about the soil, the terrain in French, and thinking the same way about the body when he came down with cancer, that you needed to tend the body's soil. And it seems that it's what you're talking about in this wonderful book, Pharmacology, spelled with an F rather than a PH.
Absolutely. First of all, your Uncle Leo sounds like he was very much of what we call a regenerative farmer, someone who really was thinking in a whole systems approach. And we have lots of terms for that. Some people call it sustainable farming or eco-farming or regenerative farming. But it really is this idea that a farm is a very complex web-like system and that you have to pay attention to all the parts. And in fact, in medicine, we really have not done that. We've taken a reductionist approach where we tend to divide the body up by diseases or by organ systems or by, treating it with one specific bullet pill rather than thinking about it as this complex web-like system. But there is certainly in medicine a side tradition of taking that more complicated approach. And I feel like there has, in recent years, been a resurgence in that way of thinking that's very exciting. And I think it's going to translate into better health and better care for all of us. And it's funny that you mentioned cancer because, in fact, in one of the chapters in Pharmacology, and that's Pharmacology with an F is the name of my book, I do spend time with an eco-farmer who is really taking this whole system approach to pest management. And what that does is leapfrog me to working with an oncologist who's using this integrated pest management approach, this whole system pest management approach, to treat cancers, something that's radically different from the way we traditionally treat cancers, where we sort of treat them as this vermin that needs to be eradicated at all cost. These new sort of eco-oncologists are really thinking of it as one kind of cell in a larger system, and how can we manage it within the larger system, both by supporting the healthy cells and by keeping the cancer cells at bay, but not necessarily eradicating them with poisons. And what they're finding is, in fact, the patients live longer.
Tell us a little bit more about that approach to cancer. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, well, this is something which is still very much in the research and development mode. And whenever I talk about this, I'm very quick to stress that you should not be firing your conventional oncologist and turning your back on what medicine has to offer, because they're very powerful tools there that are really important to survival. But what we've seen traditionally in cancer care is that, in fact, we tend to go aggressively towards treating the cancer. And what happens is that in the short term, you do get an eradication of cancer cells, but that the more resistant ones sort of lay at the periphery, and in 5 to 10 years tend to come back with a vengeance and take over the body. And that's often the story you hear. Oh, someone went into remission and then 10 years later they succumbed very quickly to a cancer. And that's because of very basic evolutionary concepts that the fittest cells are able to outwit the chemotherapy or outwit the surgery and then come back with a vengeance, as I described. Now, the same pattern was noted when we were doing conventional pest management, that you'd take a pesticide and you'd spread it all over the field to get at your moth or get at your worm or get at your fungus. And indeed, whatever the offending agent was would die off, but there would be some that were hardier, some that 2% that were hardier, and that were able to develop a resistance to the chemical that you were using. And then they were the ones that would come back with such powerful resistance that nothing in our armamentarium could possibly treat them. And that, in the end, would be, you'd get into a nuclear war against them and, try stronger and stronger chemicals. And in the end, you would not be able to fight them and the field would be destroyed. So what integrated pest management has done, and it really is leading the way in terms of us thinking in this new pest management approach, is what happens if we don't try to kill whatever this offending agent is at all costs? What happens if instead we think about how to co-manage it in a healthy ecosystem? So what these farmers are doing is they're starting to plant what are called beneficial plants that are attracting healthy insects that are then able to keep these less beneficial insects at bay. They're also looking at the weather patterns within that field. For example, if the field is very wet and that's attracting fungi, then they might allow more weeds to grow because that will pull water from the plants, allow them to be less damp, and so they'll grow less fungus. So they're thinking in this very complex way. They're bringing owls and other animals into the fields by putting owl boxes up on high on poles, and then the owls will attack the voles and the other rodents that could potentially attack the roots of the plants. So these very complicated systems. So what these oncologists are doing is looking at this same way of thinking, these forward-thinking oncologists are doing, and they're saying, how can we boost beneficial cells in the body? How can we not just attack the cancer cells, but how can we keep healthy cells healthier so that they attack cancer cells? How can we actually turn on genes that will prevent the reproduction of cancer cells? What are nutritional factors that might change the pH or the oxygen saturation or the blood flow in the cancer areas so that we might keep these cancer cells at bay? And they're changing the conversation from cancer being this deadly foe that you must kill at all costs to thinking of it more as a little bit of a nuisance, a pest that must be kept at bay, and that you sort of use the whole system to keep it at bay.
Well, it sounds so logical. The idea that you want a system working together. And I think sometimes about Chinese medicine or Indian medicine and the whole notion of trying to get the body to be involved rather than these silos where we're trying to, beat certain organ systems into submission, and we don't always succeed.
No, it's very exciting. And Bob Gattenby, who's one of the researchers who's doing this work at Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa in Florida, has actually been receiving quite a bit of funding from the National Institutes of Health because they see this as a very promising way forward. And he actually has a whole group of colleagues around the country. They call themselves evolutionary oncologists or integrated oncologists. And they are really starting to do the research to see how this works. And, a lot of these trials have not yet been introduced to human cancer care, but certainly when they've looked at it with mice and in other areas, it's really quite astounding how by taking this more gentle approach, the cancer might exist for a lot longer, but the creature stays alive a lot longer as well.
You're listening to Dr. Daphne Miller, a family physician and founder of Whole Family MD. It's the first integrative primary care practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Her book is Farmacology: What Innovative Family Farming Can Teach Us About Health and Healing.
After a short break, we'll learn about a ranch in Missouri and an allergy researcher in Munich, what they can tell us about germs on the farm and the hygiene hypothesis.
Does exposure to a wide variety of microbes at an early age reduce our chances of having allergy and asthma problems in later life?
When farms build up their soils naturally, do they offer us lessons on restoring our own bodies after disease?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Redx Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
And by Squatty Potty Toilet Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 959. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today on the People's Pharmacy, our topic is pharmacology, spelled with an F. What can we learn about health from ecologically sustainable farming practices?
Our guest is Dr. Daphne Miller, a family physician and founder of Whole Family MD, the first integrative primary care practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at UCSF. Her book is Farmacology: What Innovative Family Farming Can Teach Us About Health and Healing.
Dr. Miller, one of the stories in your book, Pharmacology, is a connection that you draw between your visit to the Rockin' H Ranch in the Ozarks of Missouri and what we would call the hygiene hypothesis. Would you tell us, please, a little bit about why being exposed to certain germs early in life might help protect kids from allergies and asthma?
This was quite an adventure for me that started in the Ozarks and ended up in Munich, Germany. I actually went to work with Cody Holmes, who's a rancher in Missouri, who runs a really innovative cattle ranch where he runs his cattle in a mob grazing style. Some people call it holistic ranching, very much trying to imitate the way that the bison moved through the Middle States in the early, late 1700s, early 1800s, the way that grazing happens in the wild, traditionally with animals. And the reason that he runs his cattle this way is because it is better for the soil and better for the animals. They found that when they have the animals intensively graze in one area and then leave that area for almost a whole year and then come back to it, that it deposits all these nutrients into the soil from the cattle being there and then allows it to regenerate and grow back all the native grasses. And you get a rich array of biodiversity in the grasses and a rich array of biodiversity beneath the grasses and the microbes in the soil. But what Cody has found is that it also leads to much healthier cattle, and that when he stopped doing traditional ranching where he used a lot of antibiotics and dewormers and a lot of corn feed and moved to this mob-style ranching, that virtually all the diseases he was seeing in his cattle, all the upper respiratory diseases and gastrointestinal diseases, disappeared. And he wasn't having calf death and all these things that traditionally the conventional farmers see on their ranches. So when I was working with Cody, I said to him, why do you think that your calves have suddenly become so healthy with this new system of farming? And he said to me, well, it's easy. It's all those microbes in the soil, all those billions of microbes that are coming back to the soil as a result of doing this mob-style grazing. And I thought, well, that makes sense. But, I'm a skeptic and, I'm a scientist by training. So I went back home and I started to do research in the medical literature and in the science literature, trying to figure out what the science was behind what Cody was saying. And sure enough, I came across all these studies that were done by a consortium that's headed up by a woman named Erika von Mutius, who's head of allergy and asthma at Munich Children's Hospital in Germany. And what the studies showed was that children who are raised on traditional farms that are ecologically managed have much lower rates of allergy and asthma and upper respiratory infections as compared to children who are raised in cities. And Dr. von Mutius was studying this, so I flew to Germany to spend some time with her. And when I asked her, what is causing this difference, this remarkable benefit for the children on the farms, she gave me the same answer as Cody did on the ranch. She said, it's easy. She said, it's all the microbes on those farms. And she actually went to her computer and brought up this amazing picture that showed a mom in a stable throwing hay in the air and a bunch of cows standing around and munching. And on on the floor was a bouncy seat. And in the bouncy seat was probably like a 2-month-old baby who's just sitting there right next to all the cows and sort of enjoying all this hay being thrown in the air. And, obviously that's totally counterintuitive because we call allergies hay fever. And here's this mom who's throwing hay in the air around her baby. But what Dr. von Mutius has showed us is that, in fact, what seems to really make the difference is that these sustainable farms have a whole biodiversity of microbes in the soil and from the manure from the cows and from the raw milk that's served and from the fungi that's, there in the hay that was freshly grown in the field and all these things that tend to inform our immune systems very early on when we grow up in those places. And what the research is showing that's even more remarkable is that those microbes on the farm are actually having a conversation with the microbes in our intestines and then the other linings of this, of our body, our own microbiome. And it's this sort of microbe-to-microbe conversation that, in fact, is probably what is educating our immune system early on to not overreact to the wrong things, which is essentially what allergy and asthma is sort of our immune system turning on the wrong things. And it teaches it how to have an appropriate response and how to keep us free of those health problems.
Well, Dr. Miller, you mentioned raw milk. And, I can hear all the public health officials who are listening to us shuddering and going, oh, what is she talking about? That's what causes health and illness issues.
And you actually describe your own reaction when you are presented with a glass of raw milk that very first evening on the Rock and Age Ranch.
Yes, indeed. I was fairly horrified. And it's interesting because having spent time with Erika von Mutius in Germany, who's written a number of academic papers on the health benefits of raw milk, I sort of come down where she is, and that raw milk is not a solution for most people on this planet because it really is something that if you are going to drink raw milk, you had better know that farm and that farmer exquisitely well and get it super fresh. As Dr. von Mutius says, when they drink raw milk on these traditional farms, if they don't finish it by noon, they throw it out and they go and they milk the cow again by evening because by its very nature, raw milk, if there is something lurking in there that shouldn't be there, you don't want it sitting and growing and replicating till it actually could become something of clinical significance.
Well, that was certainly my experience growing up on the dairy farm. I mean, we would sometimes get milk, straight from the cow, literally, and drink it in the barn, but it was always fresh, within a day. And after a day or two, no. Or it got turned into cheese, and then it was a whole different kettle of fish, so to speak, or kettle of cheese.
I equate drinking raw milk to having unprotected sex. I tell my patients in both cases, you better both have been tested very well and know exactly who you're doing this with and, have it be something that really is a consensual relationship with lots of knowledge and lots of intimacy. And it really goes the same for drinking raw milk from a farmer. You better know exactly what that farmer's farming practices are and how they're collecting the milk and that you've gotten it fresh from the farm. So I do feel like in terms of what the solution is for most of us, it really is just to understand how those benefits from raw milk can be extrapolated so that we can actually use that knowledge in other forms of asthma and allergy prevention. And Dr. Mutius is actually involved in some interesting studies, even looking at milk filtration rather than, because it's the heating the milk to very high temperatures and then homogenizing it or, running it through these pipes to really change its consistency that seem to, bring a lot of the proteins to the surface and create a more allergenic substance. So, and also denature a lot of the beneficial bacteria which are there. But I don't want us to run away with the raw milk issue. It really isn't, the cornerstone of what's going to prevent allergy and asthma. What for me is much more interesting is the whole farm ecology and the idea that getting kids out in nature and getting them into a biodiverse environment and exposing them to animals early, into a whole diversity of foods relatively early, really might hold the ticket for reversing some of the allergy and asthma epidemic that we're seeing right now on this planet.
Well, speaking of exposing them to a diversity of foods early, you talk about watching the calves graze. On the Rock and H Ranch, Cody has also decided he didn't need to take steps himself to wean the calves, as most ranchers do, that he would let them wean themselves, or he'd let their mothers wean them, as the case may be. And it turned out, to his surprise perhaps, or to somebody's surprise, that it worked very well. But you also point out that these calves then eat a much wider variety of plants that they find in the pasture, and that there are some parallels with human babies. Tell us a little more about that, please.
Yes, there were so many lessons for me from Rock and H, and it's exactly as you described it, Terry, that Cody did something really radical on his ranch by not weaning his calves and leaving them with their mothers. And the traditional thinking amongst ranchers is, of course, you need to wean your calves so that the mothers will be ready to get pregnant again, and that not weaning them will somehow lessen the mother's fertility. And in fact, Cody found the exact opposite. He found that the mothers were fine and that the babies thrived. And what was sort of an unintended benefit of this was that he found that each generation of cows was doing a better and better job of eating the grasses and eating the forbs that were out there in the prairie. And his hypothesis really is that mothers are teaching their calves how to have a diverse palate and how to eat. And that, in fact, also by just getting the milk from the mothers that offers all the tastes from the pastures, rather than getting this super sweet formula, which is what calves traditionally get once they're weaned, that these little calves really are maintaining a very complex palate and are willing to try things that they otherwise might not try. And, what's so interesting is that similar research has been done with humans. They did a study at the Center for Taste in Philadelphia. A researcher named Julie Manella did the study. And what she did was she actually had pregnant mothers and nursing mothers. One group she had eat carrots, and the other group she told them not to eat carrots. And then once the babies were weaned, she fed them all carrots. And what she found was that the babies who had already been getting carrots through either breast milk or through the amniotic fluid when they were in utero were much more excited about that kind of bitter taste of carrot than the babies who hadn't been exposed previously. The babies who hadn't been exposed grimaced and turned their head away and ate significantly less of the carrot and than the babies who had somehow had this flavor before. So this really, for me, made me understand how nursing can educate the palate, but not only nursing can educate the palate, that the amniotic fluid can educate the palate. Because what are babies doing when they're in utero? They're actually drinking that soup. They're drinking that amniotic soup, and it offers many of the flavors that the mother has been eating.
So the babies are going to be already pre-adapted, as it were, to the diet they'll be exposed to in the family, presumably.
Absolutely. I had my own experiment in my household with my daughter. She was sort of, I had this aversion to garlic and didn't eat it during my pregnancy. And then she actually thought that garlic was disgusting, whereas somehow in my second pregnancy I ate a lot of garlic, and my son is an enormous garlic fan. So there's your very unscientific N of 2.
Now, at the first farm that you visited, Jubilee Farm up in the state of Washington, you drew some other lessons that you could apply to a patient that you were seeing, a woman we'll call Allie, in your practice back in San Francisco. Would you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yes. Eric Hawkinson is the farmer at Jubilee, and he's a really interesting guy because he actually didn't farm his whole life. He went to Yale Divinity School and did some graduate work there, and then he was a salmon fisherman for a while. And then in the early 90s, he bought Jubilee. And it's a 12-acre farm in Washington State. And when he bought it, the soil was really a mess. It had been abused for decades before he took it over. And he realized that what he was growing on the soil was really did not have good nutritional value. And his goal was to nourish his community. As I said, many of these farmers really are people healers. What they want to do is produce things that are going to keep their community healthy. So what Eric started to do was something that in traditional agriculture is called test and replace. He was taking samples from his soil and sending them off to the lab, and the lab would give him these readouts, these lab reports of what was missing from the soil, and then he would buy these supplements and add them back to his soil. And he was doing this season after season and spending a lot of money and realizing that the test reports weren't getting that much better. And he started to have other qualms. He read the packaging and realized that it said, wear a mask while dispersing these. And he thought, if I'm doing organic farming, why should I be wearing a mask when I put these supplements in the soil? Are they poisonous? And also he started to wonder where the supplements were coming from. Were they taking them from soils in Africa and Asia and the Middle East where they might need these supplements more, these natural minerals more than we need them here in North America? Well, anyway, what Eric started to do was something that we would call holistic or eco or regenerative farming, much like Joe's Uncle Leo, which was just really stopping all the supplements and all the additives and really using the resources on his farm to keep it healthy. So he started to regenerate all of his waste, all of his organic matter back into the soil. He started to rotate animals over his land, much the way that Cody did, in order for them to fertilize the soil. And he started to use seeds that worked better within that climate and started to conserve water and really did cover crops and intercropping and all these very ecological ways of maintaining the land. And sure enough, his soil started to get better. And so his tests started to normalize for the first time. So while I was working with Eric, I really asked myself, well, what would happen if my patients started to eat from a farm like this, and specifically patients who were depleted in their nutrients and in their minerals, much like his soil was? I mean, would they get better as well? Would they become a part of this eco-farm cycle?
You're listening to Dr. Daphne Miller, a family physician and founder of Whole Family MD, the first integrative primary care practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Her book is Farmacology, that's with an F, What Innovative Family Farming Can Teach Us About Health and Healing.
And you know what my Uncle Leo used to use to replenish his soil?
Cow manure?
Exactly. There was a manure spreader. We need to take a short break. Coming up, what can we learn from the differences between the gut bacteria of healthy people in rural Burkina Faso and those in an Italian city?
What about fermented foods? And does it make sense for us to try to buy organic?
Are these findings relevant for people who live in the city? How does urban farming affect city communities?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening to this podcast of The People's Pharmacy. If you like it, why not rate or review it in the iTunes store? We'd appreciate it.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Squatty Potty Toilet Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
And by Redx Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 959. That number again, 800-732-2334, or online at peoplespharmacy.com.
We're talking about how farming practices affect the food we eat and ultimately our health. Are the bacteria in our intestinal tract affected by our farming practices and our diets? Our guest is health explorer Dr. Daphne Miller. She's a family physician and founder of Whole Family MD, the first integrative primary care practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's also an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Her book is Farmacology: What Innovative Family Farming Can Teach Us About Health and Healing.
Dr. Miller, we were just listening to you describe a leap of understanding, as it were, from a sort of eco-cycle farming at Jubilee Farm to an understanding that you had about how it might affect your patients. Would you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, so this is a fascinating area for new discovery, and I would be misleading you if I said that scientists have completely connected the dots between how a healthy farm cycle can give you healthy people. But the research that is coming out is so compelling. And for example, on the soil end, there's a researcher in Washington State University named John Reginold who's done a series of studies showing that when you have a more complex microbiota in the soil, so more biodiversity of microbes in the soil, that you get more nutrients in your plants, and that there's a direct relationship there. And that sort of makes sense because the more microbes you have in the soil, the better they are at harvesting nutrients and passing them on like little messengers to the roots of the plants and nourishing those plants. But what's fascinating to me is on the other side of things, there are microbiologists who are studying humans and realizing that humans who are eating from farms that are more ecological or more diverse in what they produce have microbes in their intestine that are better at processing vegetables and passing those nutrients on to us. So basically microbes in our gut who are doing kind of the same job as microbes in the soil. And guess what? Those microbes that are in the intestine, the microbes in the soil that are good at harvesting greenery, they look fairly similar. They're actually from the same families. And these studies that are being done in humans are ones that are being done with traditional tribes like the Hunza in Africa or the Bulpan who are in Burkina Faso in Africa. And what they're doing is actually looking at the microbiota in the intestine of these tribes who are basically what we would call a pre-contact tribe. They're certainly not eating from McDonald's. They're not eating any processed food. Everything they're eating is really directly from the soil. And the kind of farming that they're doing is this full cycle farming. And what they're finding is that their profile of microbiota, the microbes that they're hosting in their gut, look very different from people who are living in urban areas. And these particular researchers were comparing them to people who are living in Italy, in urban areas in Italy. So somehow when we eat from healthy regenerative soil, we get a profile of microbes in our gut, which are good or better at harvesting nutrients from grains and from greens and so on.
When we're talking about microbes, one of the sources in our diet actually is fermented foods, which are beginning to get some attention from the foodies around the country. What's your view on the value of fermented foods?
Fermented foods are actually a really valuable health resource. And when that patient, Allie, that I told you about, that was one of the interventions I used with her. If you think about it, the microbes that are fermenting those foods are microbes from the soil. And so what you're getting when you eat fermented foods is kind of a uber dose of soil microbes. Now, we're not really sure exactly how those microbes interact with our own microbes to keep us healthier. But one of the theories is that they actually pass on DNA cassettes, so little lengths of DNA once they get into our gut that educate our own microbes and make them healthier.
That's a nifty idea.
Well, we know that a lot of them are sort of inactivated or actually killed by the acid in our stomach. And so it's not necessarily that the live microbes that we are eating from these foods are the ones that are sort of doing the trick, but it's really that they're passing information on to our own microbial DNA and that there's some kind of swap that's going on there that is beneficial to us.
So, Dr. Miller, have you tried any of these strategies on your patients, and what's been the outcome?
Well, with that patient, Allie, who I describe in the first chapter of Pharmacology, she was someone who was incredibly depleted and was really eating just energy bars and packages of chicken that she was buying at Costco. I encouraged her as sort of step one to try and literally enter an eco-farm cycle and find a sustainable farm and get one of their CSA boxes and change her diet around so that she was eating from that farm. And this was a woman who had taken tons of supplements and gotten many, many different kinds of tests and seen a whole array of doctors and other kinds of health providers and really was practicing what we would call test and replace, just like Eric Soil, and getting no better. And as soon as she shifted the way that she was doing things and started to eat from a farm, she started to improve. And actually, a lot of her deficiencies, her vitamin D deficiency, her iron deficiency, a bunch of things normalized. And a lot of her intestinal symptoms, she had a lot of irritable bowel type symptoms, a lot of them got better as well. What was interesting about Allie is she then took things further and she started to volunteer in a school garden. So she was working directly in the soil and being out in the sunshine. And there was a whole social factor to this as well. Her mood improved. And so what created all these benefits for Allie? Who knows? I didn't test her microbiota, but was it eating from the farm? Was it getting connected to real food? Was it an actual physiologic thing that happened in her gut? Was it more of an emotional thing? Was it being in a little bit of sunshine and boosting her vitamin D levels that improved her mood? You know, there's many explanations for why Allie got better, but certainly in her case, entering an eco-farm cycle was something that was curative.
You know, I always get somewhat concerned when we approach this sort of case as a reductionist model. Let's figure out the one thing that was responsible for her healing. Why not consider everything? You know, the exposure to sunlight, the social interaction with people, not to mention the food, the real food that she was eating.
Absolutely. And, you know, within health research, those are the kinds of questions that we need to start asking, these sort of big package or whole system questions. There's a couple problems with them. They're harder to ask, they're harder to study, and they're certainly a lot harder to fund because the way that our system works is we are always in search of that pill that we can patent and market, you know, that silver bullet that we can sell. And I think that we as consumers are also guilty of that. You know, here's this doctor who's sitting there and telling us this whole complicated thing that we need to do to get well. We need to reconnect with our soil and reconnect with our farms and reconnect with our community. Isn't there something I can buy off the shelf that will do this for me? And there really isn't.
Well, speaking of buying something off the shelf, what about organic food? Is there anything special about organic food? I'm putting aside the CSA idea, the community-supported agriculture that actually links the consumer to a specific farm. But a lot of people don't have access to that, but they may have access to organic food. And I think we have heard quite a few opposing opinions about whether or not there's any value in spending the extra money on that.
Well, organic is a label which unfortunately has lost a lot of its meaning. It is probably still better than nothing, but there's a lot of, most of what is producing organic food, around the country now is actually these large factory-style farms that are just simply, they've swapped out chemical pesticides or synthetic pesticides and herbicides for ones that are organically based. But from everything that I've just been talking about, you can intuit that anything, whether it's synthetic or organic, if it's killing microbes in the soil, it's not something that you want to be applied in a place where you grow your food. So the idea that really is much more important is this regenerative model. And in fact, if you look at it, there's a lot of farmers who are really taking excellent care of their soil and are farming in this whole system way who are not certified organic, and whose produce might be a lot cheaper because they aren't having to keep up with all the organic certification. So I encourage people to try and get to know their farmers and get to know their farms and understand the system that the farmer is using. Questions that you can ask are, do he or she live on the land and eat from the land? Because I can assure you that in 2014, which is where we are now, most farmers who truly are feeding their family from the land are treating that land as if it were a member of the family and, doing this full system type, this ecosystem type farming because they want that soil to be there and working for them generations from now. Other questions you can ask are, do they rotate their crops throughout the year, or do they have one thing that they grow and that's it? Do they tend to try and grow things that work well within that climate, within that planting system? Or are they trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, growing melons in a climate that can't sustain it, for example? How are they doing in terms of other things like how are they treating their employees? There's a big correlation between how well you treat the soil and how well you treat your workers. Or are there lots of workers who are feeling like they're unfairly treated by that owner? You can go visit the farm and look at it. It's amazing how good we are with our own eyes at assessing what a healthy farm looks like. Are there lots of different kinds of things growing? When you kneel down and take a handful of that soil, does it feel like chalk or powder in your hands, or does it feel like something that really is rich and alive and has things moving in it? These are the things that we need to start to get interested in and get reconnected to.
Dr. Miller, we've been talking a lot about farms, out in the country, like the one that I grew up on. But what about people who live in the city? I mean, you've visited an urban garden in the Bronx. Can you tell us about that and maybe a little bit about the benefits of gardening in an urban environment?
Yeah, so first of all, a lot of these farms actually are relatively close to cities, and I think that there's becoming a much more of a connection between urban dwellers and their farmers, even if the farmers are an hour or two outside the city. There really is becoming a very closer relationship. But urban farming is also an incredibly powerful resource, not just in terms of a way to produce food for people who otherwise wouldn't have access to good, healthy food. But it turns out that when you start gardening in a community, that there's all kinds of health benefits that start to happen beyond just the vitamins in the food. And there's a lot of researchers who are studying urban farming now as this powerful public health intervention. It turns out that communities that have urban farms have lower crime rates, even if they have the same socioeconomic level, same type of population as another community. It looks like just having the urban gardening can decrease crime rates in that community. And there's a lot of reasons why. Maybe it has to do with getting rid of vacant lots. Maybe it has to do with keeping youth more occupied, creating a sense of community. It turns out that people who are involved with urban gardening drink a lot less alcohol, that seniors involved with urban gardening have slower rates of mental and physical decline, that students involved with urban gardening have less scholastic problems, especially kids with attention deficit issues. They're able to really focus very well when they're doing this kind of work. So all these health benefits that are starting to be noticed from urban gardens that people hadn't really thought about. So it's actually something that I really am advocating for as part of our healthcare system. And what's interesting, I actually was in New Haven in Connecticut about 6 months ago. I was invited to give grand rounds by the Department of Psychiatry at Yale University. And the reason they invited me is because that department is starting to put in urban gardens as a way of doing outpatient treatment for their psychiatric patients. And they're starting to find that there's huge health benefits there with mental illness.
Well, in summing up for our listeners, can you share your thoughts about how the farmers are taking care of their soil, how we as humans should be taking care of our soil, our body's terrain?
Well, I think the most important thing that we can learn from farmers is this web-like complex way of thinking. And oftentimes when the solution just feels terribly appealing because it is so simple, it's actually not what's going to keep you healthy in the long run. And not only can we learn from farmers in terms of a valuable paradigm for how to keep ourselves healthy, but we can also look to farms as an immediate resource for how to keep ourselves healthy. And by connecting with healthy farms and supporting healthy farms, we actually are going to be getting an incredibly powerful medicine, a medicine that will heal our bodies and also potentially heal the planet. So those two connections are really, really important.
Dr. Daphne Miller, thank you so very much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You've been listening to Dr. Daphne Miller, a family physician and founder of Whole Family MD, the first integrative primary care practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Her book is Farmacology: What Innovative Family Farming Can Teach Us About Health and Healing. And, of course, pharmacology in this case is spelled F-A-R-M-A-C-O-L-O-G-Y, pharmacology. There's a link to her website from peoplespharmacy.com. And I'd like to dedicate today's show to my Uncle Leo, who was a family farmer who really would appreciate Dr. Miller's message.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarsky engineers the program. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
To order a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 959. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can find it on the website, peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit the site, look for our Listen and Read offer that combines Dr. Miller's book, Pharmacology, with the CD of this interview. You can also check out prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your own experience and thoughts on today's show.
And while you're there, you can sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You'll never miss another People's Pharmacy program again. You can also share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to the People's Pharmacy.